Good evening, everyone. My name is Carson Badger with Badger Sports Management, and I'm here with episode 1. The goal of this channel in these series is to look at the history of college sports, the business issues, the legal issues that have evolved over the course of the last 150 years to ultimately understand the NIL landscape as it exists, the key themes that have intertwined over the course of its history, and then where I think the industry is going to be going for purposes of educating all players in the space, institutional players, athletes themselves, and ultimately thought leaders that can be able to shape this industry as it goes. Now, to start off, I'm going to use while I love the history of this element, I'm going to keep things topical. This was a kind of tidbit I picked up when I was a student at the University of Washington studying political science. And during my major, before every class and every lecture, we would bring in news. Each student would raise their hand and talk about 2 to 3 political issues going around the world, and we would have an open forum discussion. So I want to integrate that into this series. I think while I will be going back and take the time to really unwind this space, at the same time, I want to keep things topical, be able to hit on what I think are 2 to 3 issues within each week. So the first that I want to highlight for this week's episode is the injunction that was just filed by Texas Tech's quarterback, Brandon Sorsby, that he filed regarding his eligibility. Now, the back context for Sorsby was he was an all Big 12 conference player at University of Cincinnati, and then he signed and entered the transfer portal to go down to Texas Tech, who is currently notorious as one of the big spenders in the NIL space. He had a multi-million-dollar figure attached to his name, and within it, which is interesting enough, is there was dispute about his NIL contract he signed with the University of Cincinnati. But that's not the issue that we're looking at here today. Instead, it has been discovered that Sorsby, when he was at the University of Indiana, made a handful of sports wagers and sports gambling bets related to his team, as well as a lot of microtransactions for various sporting events. Now, this is against the NCAA Code of Conduct, and so NCAA came out and recently suspended Sorsby for this upcoming season. Now, to counter, Sorsby filed an injunction requesting that he be able to play for this upcoming season while the NCAA handles their dispute. The NCAA, their hearing process can often take months, if not year, and so the request on this injunction is that while the amateurism conversation with his sports gambling gets heard in the court of the NCAA, that Sorsby be able to play this upcoming season. The argument within the case is that he would receive kind of an unfair, undue punishment. His value as an athlete, this is his last season as an eligible athlete, would forever to be harmed, as well as the consequential damages of his career, potentially going down to the NFL. The reason why I'm really following this case is it's a big-time athlete. Like I mentioned, there is rumors of a multi-million-dollar figure attached to his transfer from Cincinnati to Texas Tech. Texas Tech is notorious for being one of the big spenders in the NIL space, and they're competitive. They were in the college football playoffs last year, and now they've got their guy, their quarterback, and yet he's embroiled in the controversy when it comes to this topic of amateurism. And not even amateurism, but eligibility. What defines an athlete under the guise of the NCAA? That's going to be some themes that we're talking about a little later today that were laid out back in the 1800s. And so this is one to watch. I think Darren Heitner, who's a NFL, and not NFL, but really kind of one of the preeminent lawyers within the NIL space, he's talked about the impact that what judge you're hearing can play a really big role in your case. When it comes to LSU and Will Wade with their college basketball program, they're really pushing the boundaries on who they can bring in, guys who have played in the professional leagues. So within that, this case with Sorsby is going to be fascinating to watch. Sports gambling is normally a complete no-no in the NCAA's eyes. And you've got millions of dollars invested in Texas Tech. They have their person, they have their athlete, and so they're going to fight tooth and nail with everything they can. Sorsby hired a premier law firm to represent him on the case, and so this will be one to watch. This could set precedent, again, handling these really boundary cases. That's where the law often gets discovered, is these edge cases are really one to worth track, and this is what I'm keyed in on. So that's the first kind of news topic that I'm excited about to see what happens. And the second is the rumors of the expansion of the college football playoff. It has come out after the recent Big Ten meetings that almost unanimously all of the Big Ten coaches are on board of expanding to a 24-team playoff. Now, the reason why this is interesting is, one, the Big Ten has won most of the national championships in the last couple of years. So to see unanimous kind of support among this field expansion, but it also plays into big roles. The ACC, the Big 12 are in support of this topic. Within kind of further layout, though, this goes into this other topic that's going to be preeminent throughout this series is the business of the sport. How much money each team makes. I'm going to talk about that too today. How the athletic department pays for itself. These are businesses at the end of the day. There's profit and loss statements. There's funding that requires donations for boosters. And it's definitely one that I'm aware of with this expansion of NIL. We're paying our athletes across the board. Where does that money come from? What is the revenue behind it? Yes, I know there's ticket gates and merch, and obviously, you have your, all your revenue streams, but does it offset? Are we able to pay our players in a scalable fashion as this goes year over year as an industry? And the reason why this expansion within the playoffs is a play is because it allows for more gate revenue, bigger games earlier on in the season, more ranked matchups. The idea within a lot of the Big Ten is that if there are meaningful football games played in November and potentially home games or home playoff games being played in early December, that's going to drive revenue. If it drives revenue, then all of a sudden that has a trickle-down effect on the whole economy, which includes payment towards athletes. So those are my two big topics that I'm excited to see play out. I think they could have ramifications both in terms of, again, eligibility and the business of college football. So watching those, and I'll unveil next week what I think could also be out there. Now, for today's topic, I'm laying the foundation. The theory is that the issues we see today have been talked about for 150 years. And I'm actually really excited to talk about this kind of the Carnegie report at the end, but I'll get there. And I think it's really exciting to me is this idea that these themes, these fact patterns that we're seeing now, they've been happening for a long time. They've been happening since the sport got expanded. And so by tracing these root systems, we can really understand how judges are going to interpret cases, how policymakers are going to shape their local legislation, federal legislation, how people, the media, perceive these topics because they've been going on for a long time, and then ultimately within the athletes, how they can position themselves. So the idea is, let's go back before we kind of start where we are now in order to understand this whole ecosystem. So as a whole, college sports within the collegiate environment really started in the early 1820s. The first recorded evidence of any collegiate sport goes all the way back to track and gymnastics with mostly the Ivy Leagues. Educational universities really popped up in the early 1800s as kind of the country itself began to form. And then the first real documented evidence of a intercollegiate game was in 1852. Between a rowing race between Harvard and Yale. And I'm going to be working through my notes as I kind of cite through this thing, but that was the first recorded event. Now, in this race, what's interesting is there were stakes on this event. There's rumors of kind of cash prizes, expenses for their travel were paid for. And the what's fun within this kind of specific event is the winning boat. Whoever won between this regatta between Yale and Harvard would receive their own customized boat. And so it's even in kind of this first intercollegiate athlete competition back in the early 1800s, there really was no guise of amateurism. These were, for all intents and purposes, professional athletes being compensated for their time. And as we kind of go through this series, this concept of amateurism, where it pops up, how the NCAA used it for the better part of 100 years to hold back revenue from athletes becomes a really interesting theme. So when we first look at the formation of college sports, this theme of amateurism wasn't present. It was really, and if you kind of look at the broader scope of, all sports, there wasn't professional leagues. The NFL didn't come into effect until 1920. The first professional baseball league was around the 1860s. The NBA was not even a sport at the time. So there was no professional rank. When college sports first came around, that was, for all intents and purposes, professional guys. And so you had no pretenses. You had the introduction of sport, and all of a sudden there was kind of the structure of what looked to be professional leagues. And ultimately, the athletes themselves were operating as pro athletes. I think this came out in really kind of fun, examples, how people were recruited, how they subsidized and paid for sports. I think my favorite kind of story that I kind of highlighted in my research was, I'll get his name right, but James Hogan, who was a offensive lineman at Yale. He enrolled at early 1902, played on the Yale football team for 4 years as a Letterman varsity player. He was the captain of the team, and he probably has the most creative NIL package ever. Some say he broke the sport, but at the same time, he was a precedent setter. So his exact package to play football at Yale was a unique one. He had a cash scholarship of $100. He had his own suite at Yale University. He had an exclusive deal doing memorabilia and card sales at Yale. He had a 10-day vacation to Cuba, paid for, all expenses included. And I think my favorite one in terms of kind of smart, creative business thinking is he had a commission for every single cigarette sold on campus at Yale. And that was his package. It was a recruitment package at the time. And the big thing here is he was 27. So you have this grown man getting money for every single cigarette sold on campus. He had a fully expensed trip, all paid for Cuba. He had a cash scholarship, and he was playing football at Yale. This was in the trenches. He was working against his athletes. And within this space, that was kind of the penultimate example of an athlete. But for the first 50, 60 years, football coming around in the 1860s, there were a litany of examples of these schools, and primarily it started in the Ivy Leagues before the Big Ten really formed, and tons of examples of athletes being recruited against, violations, tampering, and for all intents and purposes, it looks like the sport now. And the reason why I like this is because it was before this big business started. It really was an example. And I think that's, the other nature of this, right? So we have this one concept of amateurism. And at the time when college football really started, there was no guise of amateurism. It really was this idea of, how do we look at it? It looked like a pro league, So, I don't think that there is really any idea of amateurism. But the second aspect is that we get the pro business model. And again, this is what I was talking about at the outset, right? You look at college football, you look at all of college sports, it's a business at the end of the day. And the NCAA pushed their arms against this for decades, but there is revenue, and there is serious revenue. At the time, you didn't have coaches that were paid initially until around 1880. You had the formation of conferences with the Big Ten coming in around the 1890s. University of Michigan in 1902 built their first stadium, which cost about the equivalent of $2 million at the time. They invested $50,000 in their stadium. The only way that you can pay for a stadium at $50,000 is if you're generating that much money. We had Harvard Stadium kind of, again, coming into effect. So stadiums were being built. Ticket sales and annual revenue was coming out. Now, this wasn't known. These were kind of, you put these facts together after the fact, but you're having this infrastructure that even in the early 1900s, before World War I came around, you're still showing this infrastructure, this environment that this is a legitimate business, and the key component are the athletes, are the James Hogans of the world. These guys that are actually the ones that people are playing. When we think about athletics, yes, the stadiums are nice and the hot dogs are good, but ultimately it's the athletes that we're here to pay. So in the early 1900s, we really kind of see this structure coming into place. But regulation starts to form in. Allegations about recruiting violations between Harvard and Yale and Brown going back and forth in the early 1870s, but nothing really formed yet. I think that was the big thing, is that in this early guise, there was no rules. There was no set boundaries. There was no understanding about how the game was to be played until Teddy Roosevelt steps in. Now, Teddy went to Harvard. He was a big fan of football himself. And yet, during the 1905 football season, there were 18 deaths in the football game and cited over 149 serious injuries. Now, we'll just pause there. 18 deaths occurred while people were playing football. Like, it was a gnarly sport. There was no rules. How conferences played, it was really kind of a kill sport, literally. And so this caused the whole industry to pause. The game had been around for 40 years, and yet players were dying. And so Teddy Roosevelt stepped in. And this was the first form of really regulation within sport. So he got together with the big players, invited them down to the White House, and talked about how the sport was going to survive. How the sanctity of, we just had deaths on the field. We can't keep doing this. And so that was, sorry, I'm catching myself. It's just wild. It's just absolutely wild that players are dying in football, and they still want to play the game. Nevertheless, we'll proceed. Teddy brings together the sports and the players. Now, that first formation, that White House conference, nothing formally came out. But later in that year, in December of 1906, you had 60 universities to get together, and they formed what was referred to as the Athletic Association of the United States. By 1920, that would be reformed as the NCAA. So 1906, post Teddy Roosevelt steps in, we have the first real formation of how to regulate this sport. Now, we have a regulatory body. What are their rules? Nothing came out initially. No real impact. The game was still being played under this really kind of guise of amateurism, recruiting, big revenue, but no one's really capturing anything. And again, business models really expanding. So that infrastructure still kind of exists 1906 until we'll get to the Carnegie Report. So once we kind of get into this, part, I think the part that is worth emphasizing within how kind of, this conference with Teddy Roosevelt is wanted legitimize the sport. I think for the first time it brought this kind of what was a backyard brawl into guys. Now, what I think is really interesting within this kind of 1906 conversation is the rules and the conversations from this White House meeting were really about regulating the sport, protecting the sport, ultimately, how to keep football around. It wasn't about outlawing it. It wasn't about banning it. Teddy was biased, but it was really about protecting the sport. How do we, create almost an insurance model? Liability, lawsuits, all of those things are beginning to have conversations about, like, who is responsible for these deaths and these serious injuries, and can the universities create a shield, or can they create rules that shield them from the responsibility of their athletes hopefully not dying, but injuries still happen. So there is a legitimization that happens within this meeting within Roosevelt, but I think the more interesting undertone is that the athletes aren't discussed. This concept of amateurism, not discussed. The concept of payment of players, not discussed. So they're leaving that conversation really silent. I think at the time, everyone was okay with it. The sport continued for another 20 years, kind of under the same structure. No real changes happened from, 1906 through 1920s. NCAA got legitimized in 1910, 1920, but this whole era and this in between was really about protecting the game, not ripping it away, not fundamentally shifting everything. But then we get the Carnegie Report. I think this is where, it was really the breakthrough. Now, it almost came out 100 years to the date. And it was 1829 is when this report came out. And it was a report on the college athletics. It was authored by a man named Howard Savage. And it's a fascinating read, if I could say so myself. It's almost 400 pages, 300 with actually breakdown citations and text and all that stuff. And it gives you a perfect insight into, again, not just the issues 100 years ago, but it's the same conversations we're having now about college athletics. Who pays for the tables? How athletes are recruited? What's a coach worth? What is an amateur? So these themes get brought into light. Now, the Carnegie Report, in this analysis, they visit 130 universities, and they're doing an autopsy on college sports. They're trying to gather data. And for the first time, we really get a publication about what's going on in college sports. It's been around at this point for 60 to 70 years, and all of a sudden we have this, very dense but like insightful conversation about the things that are happening in college sports. And what it does is, for me, it highlights the core issues. We're looking at the business of the sport. There is a lengthy discussion about amateurism, and for me, I found the first ever citation or rule on what defines an amateur athlete. We'll bring that up here, and in this section, again, no student shall participate in intercollegiate athletics who has ever used or is using to his knowledge off of athletics or athletic skill for gain, and is taking part in an athletic contest in which money or prize was offered regardless of the disposition of the player. So this report as a whole, it kind of teases out or is indicating where the issues are going to come. So we get our first real, to light, hey, athletes maybe shouldn't get paid. That's an amateur, right? That's that boundary. So this sport or industry has been operating for the better part of 60 years. And all of a sudden, until this report, from my research, the concept of amateurism really wasn't brought in until the Carnegie Report. And the reason why this is so insightful is because that becomes then the prevailing argument for the NCAA for the next 100 years. So this argument gets brought in with amateurism. But that wasn't it within kind of the Carnegie Report. It examines the revenue models. Who pays for all of these things? It does a really good job of autopsying and publishing data on net revenue for universities, how much they're spending on their football programs, and what are their expenditures, who has the gross margins. And this is all in the context of, at the time, the sport was really blossoming. Notre Dame's head coach is being paid more than professors, which is kind of an unknown thing. Alabama's having their first dynasty, winning 3 national championships during this era. The horseshoe at Ohio State is being built. The Rose Bowl is generating upwards of $150,000, which is equivalent of about a couple $1 million for each university at the time. So, as the sport is blossoming, the context of the rules is beginning to take form. And this Carnegie Report really is our first insight into that. And it doesn't offer recommendations. It does this full analysis and then kind of just drops the microphone and leaves the rest of the sports industry kind of in this guise. Like, how do you want to regulate this? What is the right amount of revenue? Is there a difference between public and private university in terms of how many athletes they can carry? What are the right rules around recruiting? Should an athlete be paid? And I'll pick up part 2 there. I think we'll leave that conversation for now in terms of laying the framework, understanding the initial tenets of amateurism, that when college sports first started, there was no pretense of amateurism. These were paid athletes. They were given cigarette deals, for Christ's sake. And yet, there was this blossoming business on the other side. And within this business of the sport, how does the model work? The athletes are the core thing, one of the key pieces. As much as we love the Los Angeles Lakers, LeBron James is the athlete. When we think about PGA golf, it is the Jon Rahms of the world that we're drawn to. And so this concept of how the athlete works within the business really gets laid out. I think this Carnegie Report is a perfect place to pause. And I'm excited to pick up kind of on next week's session, diving into kind of the first litigation, testing these boundaries and bringing in these themes into kind of a more colorful context and where we see it go. So, thank you all. Feel free to drop any comments or questions on this space, and I appreciate your collaboration. Thanks.